on the program, the email address lrushbaugh@eivnet.com. The Wall Street Journal, around 1 in 10 employers in America plans to drop health care coverage for employees in the next few years as the bulk of Obamacare begins, and more indicated they may do so over time, according to a study to be released today by the consulting company Deloitte. Used to be Deloitte and Touche. Do you know that? Used to be Deloitte and Touche. Don't know what happened to Touche. I guess Deloitte ate Touche. Or Deloitte consumed Touche. You had to be sure to pronounce the T there. On that. Anyway, the majority of Americans under 65 who have health insurance get it through the boss. Big question about the law is whether companies will continue to offer coverage after Obamacare implements fully in 2014. Look, this is light. This 1 in 10 will drop health care coverage. It's far more than that who are going to drop health care coverage. Pretty much everything you've been told about keeping your doctor, if you like your plan, you get to keep. It's going to be out the window. And I think a vast majority of people know it. I think that's one of the reasons there's such fear and opposition to Obamacare. Now, even though I think Deloitte's late to this, and I'm only mentioning this because now the official surveyors are starting to weigh in on this. This was known during the debate on health care, even before it passed. Now, let's move on to this internet business. And the reason that I want to spend just a little time on this before we get to your phone calls. Obama's not the first. He's simply the latest in a long line of people to cite the internet as a justification for big government. It's interesting that the internet is one of the only things they cite. Of course, Obama's now talking about roads and bridges. Do you know, by the way, the Chi-Coms have twice as many miles of roads, or we have twice as many miles of road as the Chi-Coms do. And yet theirs is the economy that's burgeoning, and ours isn't. We got twice the number of roads, and we probably have more bridges than they do. That's exactly right. With that huge landmass that the Chi-Coms have, we have twice as many roads, twice the mileage. I don't know what the figures are on bridges, but it's probably commensurate. So you have Obama is just the latest to cite the internet as evidence. Big government is solely responsible for the success of many corporations. Corporations where people work. It's about all they can cite, so they glom onto it. And it's important here, I mean, the Wall Street Journal spells it out. It's important to recognize that building great technology businesses requires both innovation and skills to bring innovations to market. And they use in this story a contrast between Xerox and Apple. Let's just get straight to it. The author of this piece is Gordon Krovitz, and it's entitled, "Who Really Invented the Internet?" A telling moment in the presidential race came recently when Obama said, if you got a business, you didn't build that, somebody else made it happen. He justified elevating bureaucrats over entrepreneurs by referring to bridges and roads, and he said the internet didn't get invented on its own. Government research created the internet so that all companies could make money off the internet. Now, Krovitz writes that it's an urban legend that the government launched the internet. The myth is that the Pentagon created the internet to keep its communication lines up, even in a nuclear strike. Krovitz writes that the truth is a more interesting story about how innovation happens and about how hard it is to build successful technology companies, even once the government gets out of the way. Now, for many technologists, the idea of the Internet traces to Vannevar Bush, or Vannevar Bush, however pronounces the name, and the presidential science advisor during World War II, who oversaw the development of radar and the Manhattan Project. In a 1946 article in The Atlantic titled As We May Think, Vannevar Bush defined an ambitious peacetime goal for technologists: build what he called a memex, through which wholly new forms of encyclopedias will appear, ready-made with a mesh of associative trails running through them, ready to be dropped into the memex, and they're amplified. Well, that, even if you don't know what that means, what it did in the scientific community, technology community, is fired up imaginations. And by the late 1960s, technologists were trying to connect separate physical communications networks into one global network, a worldwide web, if you will. Now, our federal government was involved via the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency network. Its goal was not maintaining communications during a nuclear strike, and it didn't build the Internet. Robert Taylor, who ran the ARPA program in the 60s, sent an email to fellow technologists in 2004 setting the record straight. He wrote, the creation of the ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA network, the creation of the ARPANET was not motivated by considerations of war. The ARPANET was not an Internet. An Internet is a connection between two or more computer networks. So Krovitz writes, if the government didn't invent the Internet, well, then who did? A man by the name of Vinton Cerf developed the TCP/IP protocol, the Internet's backbone, and a guy named Tim Berners-Lee gets credit for hyperlinks. You know what TCP/IP is? What is it? How would you explain TCP/IP to somebody? Somebody in Rio Linda. It's like the phone number of a computer network. Like the phone number of a computer. Okay, TCP/IP. And hyperlinks is obvious. That's the links in a story you click to take you to some other site. Tim Berners-Lee gets credit for creating the hyperlink. According to a book about Xerox PARC, Dealers of Lightning by Michael Hiltzik, its top researchers realized they couldn't wait for the government to connect different networks, so they would have to do it themselves. I mean, the government did create this labyrinth, but they didn't know what to do. I mean, they had at no time were they even pondering commercial applications for this, which is the point. You can debate, and people are going to debate this till the end of time, whether it was a network communications system for nuclear attack, whether it was this or whether it was that. The point that Krovitz is making here is that whatever it was and why ever it was invented, it was never intended by the government for commercial application. And had it been left to the government and had it remained the sole property of the government, it wouldn't exist today. That's all you really need to know about this. And yet Obama is running around claiming credit, as Al Gore did, claiming credit for it and making it one of the reasons businesses, corporations, are successful. So back to Xerox PARC. Top researchers there realized they couldn't wait for the government to connect all these different networks. They had to do it themselves. Robert Metcalf told his colleague John Schock in 1973, we have a more immediate problem than they do. We have more networks than they do. So Mr. Schock later recalled that ARPA staffers were working under government funding and university contracts. They had contract administrators and all that slow, lugubrious behavior to contend with. But full credit goes to the company where Mr. Taylor worked after leaving ARPA, and that's Xerox. It was at the Xerox PARC Labs, P-A-R-C, in Silicon Valley in the 1970s that the Ethernet was developed to link different computer networks. Researchers there also developed the first personal computer, the Xerox Alto, and the graphical user interface that drives computer usage today. Xerox did all that. They sat on it. They didn't know what they had until Steve Jobs came along and saw it. Now, one other thing about this, and I'm going to have to take a commercial break before I finish the explanation. When we were back building this program in the late 80s and early 90s, I was using CompuServe. And I'm going to lay claim I was one of the first major media personalities to start using CompuServe, which was the competitor to AOL at the time. There was no internet. Well, there was, but I'll get to that in a second. CompuServe was an aggregator. CompuServe is where you get the AP wire and the UPI wire, newspapers. I remember I was in 1986 with my Apple IIc using the Pro-DOS system. I was using it for show prep. That's when I stopped or began the process of not using newspapers. Then I bought my first Macintosh, and the process simplified. And I remember using modems, 56K modems. It took days. 14.4 was the speed. It would take 30 minutes to download a 750-word column. If you actually wanted to download, you could read it. Of course, it would all display. You wanted to download it, it took a much longer time. It took a little longer to fully display. But that became my sole mechanism. I was using 3 newspapers at the time to prep the program, and that CompuServe opened up avenues and vistas that I didn't know were possible. So I wanted to get them as a sponsor. We were trying to build this program, and we were being avoided by conventional sponsors because we were controversial. Yes, folks, even back in 1989. Even back in 1990, the liberal media and everybody else sending out warnings, don't advertise, it's controversial, it's conservative. And we're dealing with that just as we've dealt with it from the get-go. So what we had to do, we had to go out and find people that had not advertised on radio before. We were also offering a different advertising technique. The network advertising back then was called CPM, cost per thousand. Advertisers didn't care about anything other than the number of people who heard the message. It's all that mattered to them, CPM. Well, I decided we're going to have to abandon that because we're being ignored with those kind of buys, so we're going to have to do results-oriented. We had to go get sponsors who would be able to tell immediately when their advertising worked. Results-oriented. If they had a toll-free number, if they had any other mechanism for people to reach them. And CompuServe was a great test. I used them. I could endorse it. I loved it. And we'd be able to show them immediately how many new signups they'd get if they became sponsors. But they were a bunch of liberals, and they were a little leery. But to their credit, they took a meeting, and we went and met with them. And by the time I met with CompuServe, I had just heard of the internet. And I had just started dabbling with Mosaic, which was one of the first browsers. Even predated Netscape. And I didn't quite understand what I was doing. And hooking up to it was a nightmare. Connecting to the internet, I didn't know TCP IP. I didn't know all this stuff, and there was nobody to really teach me. It was self-taught on the computer. And I remember going to the CompuServe guys and they say, for the internet. That's just something that the military's using. And what was happening was, in the early days, some of the scholars and scientists that were using the internet began to send email from it and to join chat rooms from it. And people began to be made aware of things like the Alternet and the Internet and whatever it was called at the time. And everybody wanted a piece of it and wanted to find out what this was about. And the CompuServe guys properly, unbeknownst to me, looked at them as a competitor and said, the Internet's nothing. They don't do what we do. Well, we know what happened. The internet overtook everything and ate AOL and CompuServe, absorbed them and so forth in time. But that was my first exposure to the internet. Was Mosaic and the browser and trying to figure it all out. And the CompuServe guy's telling me that it's a bunch of military people. It's primarily the Department of Defense, but there's some government researchers on there, and they've started chat rooms, and those are, of course, opinion-oriented, which is what appealed to me about it. So I've got to take a break here, folks. Don't go anywhere. I'll wrap this up and bring this to a striking closure when we get back.